Let me also remind you that we will be reserving the question session for the end of the talk. Please do feel free to submit your questions using the chat function. I will coordinate with you and speaker, and please do feel free to interact with our speaker then. And with that, let's move on to today's event. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you today's speaker, Emina Osmandzikovic. Please do forgive me if I have butchered that. She will be talking to us today about young researchers in developing countries. Emina is an expert on human rights, on forced migration and displacement, and big data analysis. She has worked for the UNHCR Protection Unit in Jordan and Bosnia and Herzegovina, where she has conducted extensive field research on highly vulnerable refugee communities and returnees. Emina has also worked for the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, the UN headquarters in New York, and as a research assistant at the York University in Abu Dhabi, which is where she will be speaking to us today. She has an MPhil degree in politics and international relations from our Lucy Cavendish College, and a BA in political science with honors from New York University Abu Dhabi. She has 6 academic publications, and I hope you will be able to check them out. And with that, over to you, Emina, and we look forward to a very incredible talk.
Aishwarya, thank you so much. Before I share my screen, I just wanted to thank you and say that, yes, you pronounced my last name correctly. Thank you for that. I also want to say thank you to Lucy Cavendish College and to the University of Cambridge, really, for not only taking care of its alumni, but also reaching out and doing events periodically that really keep us all kind of together and, you know, updated about the college's events and initiatives, the expansion, and also now with the fall, with this coming semester and the coming academic year, for the first time, male students are also, you know, a part of Lucy Cavendish as well. It used to be known as one of the 3 all-female colleges at Cambridge for everybody else as well. So that's a big, big historic move. So I'm very, very happy to be an alumna. And also, I wanted to thank everybody as well for joining tonight's session, or I guess today's session, wherever in the world you are. I am definitely, you know, hoping that I will be speaking tonight to a global audience, wherever you may be. And hi to all of my friends and acquaintances and everybody who came to support me as well. Now, with that, I will share my screen. There we go. And I will just put the... Yes, all right. So first of all, I would like to say that, let me just, there we go. I would like to say a little bit about my own background and experiences before I jump into the topic at hand today, which is young researchers from developing countries in not just international relations, but also other social, natural sciences, and all of the other research and educational fields. Now, me, as many of my friends and everybody really who I worked with know, I'm from Bosnia, born and raised, and I went to New York University on a full scholarship where I was able to live, you know, across 2 different continents, in Abu Dhabi, in the Middle East, and also in New York, and work not just in Washington, DC, but Jordan, France during my summers. I was able to travel around 20-something countries, really on a full scholarship, and I would not have been able to do that without that financial support from my institution. And then moving on to my graduate studies, I also had a research grant from Lucy Cavendish to travel around a couple of EU countries, because as some of you might be aware, I did my studies and my expertise is in migration, displacement, and forced migration in particular. So, you know, without all of this institutional support, I definitely would not have been able to travel around different continents and, you know, conduct my research with people. I am today living in the Middle East as a data analyst, researcher, and, you know, somebody who's very passionate about international relations and in particular migration. So tonight, this is the second time I'm speaking at a Lucy Cavendish event. And I got to say, the first time was in person, and I was actually discussing my thesis with people who were interested enough to and kind enough to come and support and listen about refugees and minorities in a couple of EU countries. So that was some 3-4 years ago. And today, I wanted to take a step back and maybe look into some of our own backgrounds, because I met a lot of young, not just researchers, but professionals, academics, educators, but also students who come from developing and underdeveloped countries and have been attempting to establish their own names and, you know, carve out a place for themselves within sciences and social sciences in whatever respective institutions they're a part of. So going back to those, if you will, fundamentals is something that I want to and am attempting to do with tonight's conversation. And I really want this to be interactive. And definitely, I would like also for people to share testimonies later on, not just questions, because this definitely is some sort of an ongoing two-way or multiple-way conversation about young researchers, academics, scholars, and students from developing countries. Now, moving on to the second slide, what this presentation is actually about. Now, identifying the problem is the first thing. And this is not really a problem. When I say a problem, I mean in a scientific way rather than, you know, something that's problematic that needs to be solved. Identifying, I guess, the situation. Because there isn't really a lot of research done on this millions of people involved community of students and international scholars who, let's put it this way, migrate from developing and underdeveloped countries for the purpose of education and this quest for knowledge to OECD countries or other developed countries according to the UN standards of international development. And I did a little bit of research because recently this is a topic that kind of has you know, come through a lot of my interviews and a lot of my field work. And a lot of students and a lot of my friends and other people have been coming to me to ask for advice, which is why I wanted to do this conversation tonight. So nearly 4.3 million students are studying outside of their home country. And this is this was a 2011 OECD study. Now, why I wanted to bring this up, because today, actually, this number is not only double, but tripled. So even at that time, kind of some 12 years ago or 10 years ago at this point, 4.3 million students is a lot. Now imagine that being triple today. And most of them actually did study and do study in countries like Australia, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And a lot of them do come from developing and underdeveloped countries as well. So there's this huge population that definitely needs to be talked about and needs to be explored a little bit more, not only kind of in these, you know, unofficial community settings among academics, but also in proper official academic research as well. So the second one is responding to this quest for knowledge. So kind of going back to why do people leave, you know, to pursue their education abroad? And then our added value, because I consider myself one of those people, our added value on the world scene of sciences, social sciences, and other fields as well. And then the fourth one, I think, is the most informative of all, which is this opportunities for growth and development. And this is a very simple and very short presentation. So I hope that you enjoy it. And I wanted to touch on, as the first point, this quote that I came across in my research. So it all starts and ends with a quest for knowledge, for science, for academic discovery. And I came across a quote. It's a full essay, and it's a personal account from a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. A couple of years ago, he wrote this and shared with the academic community about kind of what drove him to pursue education abroad away from, you know, his native Argentina. And I think why I included this excerpt is because it's really applicable across time and space and across many different contexts. So it spoke to me as a Bosnian who studied in 2 different continents. And it rests on 3 core pillars. 1, early exposure to proper educational channels. Mentorship is the second pillar. Proper mentors, but not only mentors who you actually learn from on a daily basis, but also mentors on a, let's say, national level, mentors that are promoted by institutions in your home country. And then the third, and I think the most important pillar in practical sense, is the opportunities for funding as key drivers of one's quest for knowledge, especially when coming from a developing or an underdeveloped setting. Now, this is a quote that really spoke to me, so I'll just read some parts of it. Science has given me the opportunity to move across 4 continents and meet scientists from all around the world. For many of them, a clear role model has been fundamental in their decision to pursue a career in science, particularly for people in developing countries or minorities and people from low-income communities in developed countries. A lack of representation in science, and I would add other fields, often makes it hard to understand what steps are needed to pursue a career in STEM or other fields. It can also be very discouraging when you cannot identify people from your country or communities working in the jobs or fields you're passionate about. Now, this was an important starting point for me because it echoed not only my thoughts, but a lot of conversations that I had with people who are excelling in their respective fields and come from, underprivileged or developing backgrounds as well, and who have been lucky enough to find opportunities for funding to actually pursue their knowledge without any hiccups, if you will, or any drawbacks or limitations. Now, this prompted me to actually do a survey, which was a very short survey, preparing for this presentation, preparing for this day. And I shared it with a couple of friends, and then they shared it further. So we had this, snowball sample, if you will, it was a very brief online survey with some 6-7 questions about their own experiences coming from developing countries. And it really, the main point is the title of the slide, which is developing scientists in developing countries is really important, not only to democratize science and other fields, but also to kind of elevate their voices and, promote the networks in their home communities as well. And I definitely do think that they can add diversity to whatever team they're a part of. So from personal stories to a globally oriented insight. Now, this is a very big statement, for a short survey, but I definitely did come across, not a lot, but some research that echoes some similar sentiment as well. Now, my starting question was, as a young researcher from a developing country, as per the official UN classification, and I provided a link, have you felt or do you feel supported by your home country for pursuing education abroad? Now, the result, or what I saw, was definitely not shocking. It was a little bit disappointing because the situation has not changed for many years now. That 55% said, very clearly responded with a no. Some of them said that it was partial and that their country could have done a better job. And then there were others who said, not monetarily, but there was some sort of moral or other unofficial community support, or what one response was basically that, he or she did have access to, let's say, research or data or interviews in their respective, home community. So that definitely, coupled with a lot of other insights from people saying that, they wouldn't have been able to pursue their education if it wasn't for their institutional support, a scholarship, or an opportunity that circumvented the lack of opportunities in their home country. So that only means that, you have to really, really try very hard, work very hard, and try also to explore these opportunities with unofficial networks, with recommendations, by digging the internet, which I did, which led me eventually to the institution that I chose for my undergraduate studies. Now, the next slide, not everything is basically painted black. And I want to showcase this with the slide of this added value. What is our added value? That's one of the questions on my survey as well. And it's very important for this as well, kind of to highlight that there's definitely uniqueness, there's diversity, there's added perspective. And some of the highlights from my survey include, I got 22 responses, and these are the kind of top 4 that kept repeating, which is people feel that they have this reservoir of knowledge that can be drawn from both their home community and their educational institution in a country that they chose. then greater awareness that has led them to more solutions in whatever project that they were working on, original research methodology. And I can definitely attest to this because I myself use mixed methods. Now, that's not something necessarily, you know, that people from developing countries use. I definitely don't wish to say that. And I definitely don't wish to say that people from developed countries don't have any of these. But this is, you know, one of the highlights that I came across, this shared sentiment from all of the scholars and people that I spoke to, from my survey, from some research material that I found as well online, is that there is definitely some sense of originality because they belong to both, you know, one because of their personal background and the other because of their educational attainment. And then the fourth theme was that alternative real life perspective in terms of the explanation was kind of, you know, bridging the gap between the theoretical and the practical in terms of, you know, how are some of the theories tested in communities that are not, you know, developed. So that was a very, very interesting survey. And a lot of, I would say a plethora of interesting insights as well. And, you know, I'm taking this chance also to thank all the people who took the time to take the survey. And I would say in the next slide, this is kind of, you know, flowing naturally from the added value to the actual opportunities that I came across, I was a part of as well, I helped. Now, this is something that I also wanted to showcase, that there are many, many opportunities, but they're sometimes not advertised maybe well. People have not heard of them. I definitely think that I wanted to highlight them because either I was a part of them or I came across, and these I thought would be useful across different continents, right? So I'm going to start with the one that I was involved with myself, actually virtually when I was at Cambridge, finishing my MPhil degree. I was a remote researcher for the Ghoreir Foundation for Education that is based in Dubai in the UAE, and they help disadvantaged Arab youth from the Middle East, especially refugees as well, to pursue education abroad, to get you know, labor market relevant skills as well, which means upskilling and additional training. So I thought that was very, very cool. And, you know, as a student, I gave a lot to them in terms of background reports, background research, data analysis as well. And another institution that I came across actually very early on was the American Corner. And I think a lot of countries have this, especially developing countries, which is this. It's not really a library. It's more of a resource with a lot of books for, let's say, TOEFL or other English language, you know, exams, but also a lot of preparation for especially American universities. And I took advantage of it, and I definitely recommended it to a lot of friends. And I thought, you know, this is a brilliant, brilliant opportunity to highlight that, you know, some of their work actually does matter because it does change lives. And then we have the Erasmus for Europe. So my country, Bosnia, has been a part, although definitely the relationship was tumultuous because there was some on and off in terms of the contract. So that's another, I would say, institutional hiccup from the side of the country, which kind of implies to that revision of policies as well, and public policies, especially in educational policies in our respective home countries and home communities. So this is definitely not a plea, but I would say an observation that has that policy level, you know, importance and relevance as well. So the Erasmus one, for, you know, those who are not acquainted, is essentially that exchange on a university level between different countries and different institutions. And I know a lot of friends and a lot of people who have benefited from these. And it definitely is something that can boost one's career, that can definitely increase their insight. And I would say reverse to brain drain, it can draw knowledge and expertise and apply those to the home communities of the people, you know, who participate in these programs. And another one is, you know, related to Bosnia in particular, but I think a lot of other countries have this as well, which is the Futures Foundation. Now, this is an important aspect because it definitely has that media angle, which speaks to one of the pillars that I mentioned earlier on, which is mentorship. Because this way you have on a national level through media channels, including social media, these mentors who people can look up to. you know, having a very, very famous doctor who is a world-renowned expert on skin disease, or having a researcher who is one of the leading engineers at MIT, who are both Bosnian, and knowing, you know, where they came from, knowing what the journey was, and knowing what it took to actually get there, I think that's a very, very valuable thing to have and to look up to. And that's why whoever reaches out to me for help, I always, you know, I don't think that I've made it by any means of that word. I definitely think that I'm just starting my career. But if I can give some insight, having been at NYU and at Cambridge and having done what I did, I think definitely that serves as, you know, at least a confidence boost to a lot of young people. So having shared, you know, these, at least some of the opportunities that I've been involved with, and a lot of my friends can definitely attest to this and confirm, I think that's, I believe this is the last slide. Yes, so with that, I wanted to wrap up and definitely say that this topic of developing researchers from developing countries and allowing the exchange of knowledge, the building of unofficial communities and support networks, I think that's one of the key things that is yet to be fully explored by academic policymaking circles as well. And I think that's definitely fertile ground for a lot of conversations in the future, especially now in the post-pandemic world. So that's kind of the bulk of my presentation. And I, with that, wanted to thank you all for coming and supporting and listening. And obviously now I definitely would want not just questions, but also insights and stories shared as well. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Emina. That was actually really, really good. And I make it sound like I wasn't expecting it to be so, but I was, and it's very incredible the work that you've done. But it actually strikes a very personal note for me as well. As we were chatting before, I am an international scholar myself, having come from India. Yeah, it sounds like you're almost talking about my personal journey, so it's very nice to hear that. So as you're all aware, the question session is now begun, and let's call it more of an interaction session then. Please do feel free to put up your question or comment in the chat, or if you actually do wish to just share an experience, please do just highlight yourself in the chat function, and I will ask you to unmute yourself and you can interact with our speaker, if that's okay. And while we're waiting for our for people to start interacting on the chat function, let me just kickstart by saying that the very last point that you brought up, in terms of mentorship, I'm absolutely with you on that, because I found that it was particularly important for me to have a good mentor when I first moved from India to a different country. But actually what inspired me more was not looking at fellow Indians, more like it, because I guess there were quite a lot of us, at least where I went to school, but it was more about someone who was there to share my journey with me, not someone particularly famous or who had made it, but someone who was there to keep telling me, yes, you can do this, keep going, keep going. And of course you have your friends and family doing that, but to me it was my PhD supervisor. So I think on that I tend to, well, I mean, not necessarily differ, but I just like to add that you can be from different parts of life, but sometimes you just pick a mentor.
Honestly, I just want to kind of continue that point and say that to me as well, I think what was important for me is to see people from similar, not similar backgrounds, but yeah, similar backgrounds, not necessarily my country, doing incredible things in my field. So we did have, I know a couple of people personally as well, and through my research who are in the British Parliament, for example, or, you know, a couple of other EU institutions, and just seeing the jump and what they say. And, you know, it's, and then how relaxed and down to earth they are and how willing they are to actually share their advice really inspired me to, say, wow, yeah, this is attainable. It's okay. It's going to be hard, but what to do? Yeah. Oh, that's questions are coming in. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Aishwarya.
they are. So Selma, would you like to unmute yourself? If not, I'll be happy to read out your comment. Okay, so Selma says, great talk, and she does have a few questions stemming from the talk. What do you think about the use of media for better outreach and community building for international students, scholars, and researchers? And in addition to that, she wants to know, what do you think would be good options and practices on making this come to fruition?
Actually, that's a really good question. I gotta say, the use of media is very relative in terms of there are many different ways of doing things. I know a lot of people who have done blogs. Now, blogs are not necessarily that popular anymore, but at least when I was in college, or even in high school before that, I would say the blogs were one way of telling stories through text and picture at the same time. And I think a lot of people could relate because they were written in a very informal way. So, you see the personal side. And that's actually something that I started doing when I was going to the field to actually do my research and do my interviews. I would write these, essays that are kind of thoughts to myself, but then sometimes I would share them with friends or people who were about to do the same thing after me. So that was kind of my informal way that isn't necessarily media, but it is with blogs. Another way actually that I came across that really spoke to me, I love podcasts. I know that not everybody likes podcasts, and I know that it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I love podcasts. So to me, I had a couple of podcasts, and I can definitely share them with people, where there was one, and it's basically one by the guy who I quoted in my presentation, who traveled around Latin America and basically spoke to different people from different fields who went abroad to do their studies so that they can serve as mentors, even though they're not famous, but they are quite good in their fields, to serve as mentors or people, in his podcasts that basically other regular normal students can reach out to and ask for advice. I thought that was also very cool because you have it across different media channels. Today you can have from Spotify to different Apple podcasts as well. So I felt that's another way as well. But in terms of media, I would say definitely Instagram and LinkedIn as well. The Futures Foundation from Bosnia, they highlight their scholars with these massive pictures and, a lot of really good logos and a lot of good colors. And it's almost like Humans of New York in a way. I think that's a very cool way of depicting people. And when it comes to the second question, what do you think would be good options and practices of making it come to fruition? I think practical. I have a friend who, when she returned from her studies abroad, she was basically, she had this mission of building a project within the community. So I think doing something practical as well, I think not only does it boost your self-confidence, but also it makes you feel, wow, I can actually do something practical in my community. I can give back. I mean, whatever it is. In my field, it's not necessarily that practical. It's more like thought, something that I write and something that I see rather than building something physically. But I think in different fields, like my sister is an architect. So I suppose, her approach would be something different, maybe something, for public good. But yeah, I think practically applying something. And I think that goes back also to one of my earlier points, kind of opposite of brain drain. What can you then return to your community? What can you give back? Now, some people, they return back after many years and build centers, institutes, or, they open some sort of a scholarship scheme or a grant scheme or something. So personally, I'm more in favor of building a research center or research institution for social sciences, because I think that academic journals in my part of the world can definitely be given a better name and a better, reputation. and increase in terms of the numbers and the outreach. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on this.
But now, I mean, in a sort of post-pandemic world, I feel like the world's gotten really smaller. And do you think that we really even need to travel abroad in that sense?
That's actually a very good point. No, the many opportunities are online. So I know one of the foundations that I work with for disadvantaged students, they turned their entire programming online. And it was really cool because they were able to educate, from what I understand, thousands of people in their communities, including refugees. And we're talking about Jordan and Lebanon, where they, for example, worked in call centers and they were trained fully, virtually. And yet they were able to then contribute back to their communities and kind of, earn money and not necessarily leave their house even for that. So it was really kind of like a call support. So I thought that was a very cool way of going around the pandemic and addressing that as well, and not, I would say, disturbing the flow of education and, information. So yeah, but I definitely do support that idea of going online with some activities. Obviously others can't really, but yeah, that's kind of, and I definitely think that more and more things are going to be available online anyway. So it's just a natural flow of development. Yeah.
Indeed. So we have a question. What advice would you give someone from a developing country who wants to pursue education abroad? And what are the main things you would want them to know?
I think that's another really good question. First of all, I think it all goes back to the 3 core pillars that I mentioned, which is proper educational channels, proper mentorship, and proper funding opportunities. Because for every single opportunity, you definitely have to take into account what you're capable of undertaking, whether it's financially or whether it's in terms of the knowledge that you have to receive, the exams that you have to take. But I definitely do think that mentorship, as well, as I think highlighted many times, plays a big role there. So, and mentorship can really be just reaching out, for example, to, let's say, Lucy Cavendish, if somebody wants to apply, and having a chat with one of the representatives, because honestly, I think everybody at Lucy Cavendish is very friendly, very welcoming, and eager to give information. So I think taking advantage of these opportunities, even if it's an open day or, if it's a virtual meetup session, I think even that's a mentorship opportunity. It doesn't necessarily mean just one person. And I think funding opportunities as well, because that's, I think, one of the core, as I said, one of the most important things that basically hampers a lot of people and prevents a lot of people from pursuing their education. So understanding that is also, I think, should be taken into that context. And what are the main things that I would want them to know? Well, honestly, I think you and many other people would agree with this, is that the road is not easy, because at times I myself have felt that I have to prove myself twice as much or do twice as many activities in order to catch up with a lot of people who grew up in more privileged settings, so that we're in an equal footing at one stage, so, and I think that stays with a lot of us for life, that there's always this drive to kind of, I need to work harder, I need to, it's like proving a point to somebody, but that somebody is yourself. So I think that's another thing, that kind of knowing that there's no such thing as perfection. And that's a piece of advice that I received from one of my mentors when I was trying to publish my research, one of my early publications. He said, Emina, there has to be a line that you draw in sand at one point. It's not going to be perfect ever. If you just keep working on it, you're never going to get published. You're never going to get anywhere. You're just going to keep hitting a wall. So I think that's another piece of advice that I want to give to everybody, not just people from developing countries, but just kind of, we don't have to overachieve all the time, but just focus on what matters and what you're passionate about.
No, that's very true. That's absolutely excellent advice. I remember beating myself up as well, especially during my PhD. Like, I'm trying to prove a point. But on that note, the point about funding opportunities, for example,
visas, for example, are very limiting on the kind of funding you can actually apply for. So obviously there is also this roadblock that the institutions are inflicting upon international students or talent from abroad. So do you think that you, like the sort of research that you do, is it something that you would apply to, I don't know, but places like University of Cambridge, for example, to see if their model of recruitment can be altered at all to facilitate more incorporation or inclusivity?
To be quite frank, that's a very good question. And I think we've seen now a very well advertised initiative from Oxford. And I'll have to double check whether Cambridge did this as well. But now with the crisis in Afghanistan, they have offered additional scholarships and additional positions to Afghan women, and I think some other minorities as well. So I think that's a very, very good way of addressing an immediate crisis. But in terms of having a long-term plan of diversifying your student body and allowing people from different backgrounds and diverse backgrounds, I think that's also something that a lot of institutions in developed countries should look into, because it's not only about diversity, it's about also equality of opportunity. So kind of, preach what you actually write in your, statements and papers and whatnot. So I definitely do think that an institutional approach where you not necessarily give quotas, but at least try to work with people who require different visas or who come from different countries, to align some of the funding opportunities with their needs rather than, what's available in the country where they should be studying. So yeah, I think that's something that is yet to be seen across institutions. So I'm not really talking about Cambridge at this point, but I definitely do think that, so for example, I received my grant for my research at Lucy Cavendish, that allowed me to travel, that allowed me to conduct my field work. And I think that was very generous from the college. But at the same time, I definitely do think that these should be scaled up to not necessarily Lucy Cavendish, but different colleges, to more people, to more, I would say, scholars who are from an even more disadvantaged background than I am. Because, Bosnia is a developing country, but there are definitely other countries on the list that are much worse off. So I think that should also be paid special attention to when you look into, scholarship schemes at different institutions, especially, let's say, Ivy Leagues in the States, or, the top 20 globally and in Europe. There aren't a lot of specific scholarships for specific countries that need them the most. That definitely should be addressed as a long-term policy rather than let's respond to that crisis. So baby steps, but we still need to reach it.
That's very true. But that being said, if you, especially for something like the social sciences, if without the need for if you can provide more education online, but then sort of that way it's you've availed that sort of education to everybody, but also equally you're saying that an online degree, for example, that comes at a much lower cost and perhaps doesn't need as much funding, will be equally credited, if you will, as having physically gone to whatever Ivy League. I think that would I don't know what you feel about it, but do you think that that's another way to think about it?
I mean, I think now this past year, universities around the world and the high schools as well have had opportunities to kind of flirt with a hybrid model or online education. The sentiment that I got, at least from personal accounts, anecdotes, and stories, is that it's not the preferred way of doing things yet. That's kind of the sentiment that I got. But then again, it's kind of a personal insight based on stories rather than, I didn't do any research on this part, but I definitely do think that it would, let's say, democratize the field a little bit more and make it a bit more widely available to people who wish to pursue the same knowledge and yet are unable to. Because for every student that does have the opportunity, I feel that 20 are left behind in a way. with an equal passion, but they just weren't lucky enough. So I do think that that is an option worth exploring. I'm not really sure that we're there yet, but unfortunately, but hopefully, I am full of hope, definitely.
We have another question. Really fascinating talk. Will you undertake more fieldwork in the future? And if so, where would you like to go?
I really like this question. Yes, hopefully. Well, my fieldwork really led me, I think, started in Europe, and then Jordan, and recently to Saudi Arabia before COVID. So now I definitely want to, I would say, bridge that gap and do a little bit of field work that is between the Middle East, where I'm currently based, and Europe. So potentially something with the Mediterranean. So if it is the security question, especially of diverse groups that come through them or via Mediterranean as well, that would kind of imply, field work on both sides. So potentially that's an insight. And I did write about it, but from the Middle East rather than conducting it because of COVID at the very beginning of the pandemic. So hopefully I get to do that very soon. But thank you, actually. Thank you for the question. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions, comments? Would anyone else like to share their experiences at all? Yeah. Cool. We have another question from Amal. Amal, would you like to ask the question? Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, if you're not able to, don't worry about it. So Amal says, amazing talk. Generally, how do you think bringing international higher education institutions to developing countries helps?
Well, I benefited myself from one of them, which is New York University. Well, technically, the UAE is not a developing country, but it definitely, that was a big move from a very, very big international institution to kind of come to the Middle East. I think that on its own speaks volumes. But I do support. I mean, we have seen it around the world with American University in whatever respective country, which definitely does have that twist to the education and attracts a lot of students because, their way, the American way of doing higher education is very different from a lot of national curricula. And I would definitely say we don't necessarily have to bring institutions, but we can bring their insight and their curricula. So let's say the way the EU is doing their higher level studies is kind of 3+2, which is 3 years of undergraduate and 2 years of master's, that recently, a couple of years ago, started in Bosnia as well. So influenced by that model. So I think even if you bring a model of education rather than an institution itself, I think it helps with aligning knowledge, aligning, sharing of ideas, or even these exchange programs as well. Because obviously a lot of times you're not able to bring an entire institution, an entire campus or branch somewhere, but you do have a lot like Carnegie Mellon, for example. A lot of institutions have, like, I think Princeton has one in Singapore as well. So you do have a lot in Japan and South Korea as well. And not just the UAE, also in Qatar as well. So I definitely do think that, there is that flow of knowledge that comes through satellite campuses, which is what they're called kind of, within this field, but also from just having models applied in different settings, in different contexts as well. I 100% I support that idea because the more knowledge you have, I think, it's about options. It's about just having more options and more standardized options.
So that's a very interesting point. Do you think that if you brought the same models of education and practically the same sort of, at least the potential for such infrastructure to pretty much every institution around the world, do you think it would take away from the culture, the character, or is that what we're actually striving toward by going abroad to study? Are we trying to sort of globalize education anyway?
I think that's a very interesting question and a very good point. I think it depends because, for example, when you move to a certain country to study, like for me, I really did my best to study and learn Arabic because I was in the Middle East. And to me, it mattered to learn the language of the country where I'm in. So I think you have that as well, the effort to not acclimatize, but definitely try to understand and integrate to a certain extent into the community where you're at. But at the same time, you do have this issue of kind of, you know, that dual perspective that I referred to from one of my survey answers earlier on. There is a potential problem when you move back to your home country for research or whatever reason. It's kind of, oh, well, what you think you're better than me because you're educated abroad, you know, and now all of a sudden you're westernized. You know, you've lost the touch with your home community. So there is a very, very fine line that you have to walk, right? Kind of adjusting and picking and choosing what you learn from what community. So when we talk about it on an institutional level, if you bring a certain institution, obviously I don't support the idea of kind of wiping out the grassroots and the local. I think the best is to kind of bridge something and take the best from both worlds. But then sometimes that's not practically possible. So I also have to be, you know, realistic and say that there are certain drawbacks in bringing the global to the local. But I think that's the case with everything.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and that was an amazing discussion and a really wonderful talk. Thank you for your research. And with that, I would like to conclude today's Live from Lucy. Please do join me in applauding our speaker. And I hope you enjoyed the talk as much as I did. And we hope to see you again in person, Emina, definitely.
Same. Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, for organizing this. I loved it.
Our pleasure, indeed. And thank you all for attending today, and I hope to see you all soon. Please do remember to check our website for future Live from Lucy events, as well as other Lucy Cavendish associated events. Thank you again, and have a lovely evening and a lovely September.